Welcome back to another study of God's Word with us today. We're studying through the book of Matthew as we continue through that gospel. We're picking up in chapter 10 today. If it's your first time joining us, I encourage you to go back and look at our previous lessons. We began all the way back in chapter 1. We're just walking through the gospel of Matthew. We are looking at cross references. We're bringing in other passages, certainly bringing in the other gospels as they overlap from time to time. But really, our focus is trying to remain on Matthew's gospel and what he has to say about our King Jesus. And so, as we come into chapter 10 today, we're going to shift our focus a little bit. In the last couple of chapters, we've been looking at the miracles of Jesus. He is really laying some groundwork for who he is and sort of developing a reputation, you might say. And at the end of chapter 9, you start to see the fruit of that reputation. You start to see people opening up to the concept of who Jesus is. In chapter 10, Jesus is going to begin to capitalize on all that work that's been done because he's going to send out his disciples to go and to begin to preach the gospel more thoroughly, more fully, and to do so with some urgency. And I think that urgency is of importance because we see some of the language that Jesus uses in this chapter that indicates that. Why is it urgent? Well, because the king is here and the kingdom is coming, and it's not some distant prophecy anymore. Now it's here. And so that message takes on a greater sense of urgency. I think we can make some application of that as we go along. Welcome Michael Malloy and Johnny Lockaby. We're glad that they're with us here today, as well as Luke, and looking forward to a good study with all these guys. So as we pick up in chapter 10, it tells us that Jesus summoned his 12 disciples or his apostles, and he's about to send them out, as we mentioned. But before he sends them out, it tells us that he bestows something upon them. So just right here at the beginning of the chapter, Luke, tell us about what Jesus gives his apostles before they go out.
So in verse 1, it says, after he'd sent his disciples, he gave authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal every disease and every kind of sickness. And so he gives them the ability to perform miracles. That we read of that, but we to make sure that we focus in on the word authority. I think I'm pretty sure that is the main focus of this verse right here, because he says that he gave them not the ability, not the way to perform miracles. He gave them the authority to perform miracles. And in Luke's gospel, it actually says he gave them authority and power. And so I think that is the main focus. We don't want to look over that as we're reading through the text, because again, I think that would be easy to do so, to just think, oh, they have the power to perform miracles now. But this idea of authority brings the focus back onto Christ. These miracles weren't going to be done to show the disciples' power, or even maybe their prestige in the fact that they're disciples. They are the closest disciples of Christ. They were done to show that they had been given this power by Christ's authority, being that he is the Lord's anointed, the true Lord's anointed. And so that's the verse 1, the fact that he the authority to perform these miracles, to heal the sick and to cast out unclean spirits and demons, as it says. And I don't want to get too much into the next few verses just yet, but ultimately that's the focus so far in the text.
Yeah, and and so that power and authority, that combination, that is the necessary combination in order to perform a miracle. We can see some distinction as we go back and we look at the temptations of Jesus. The very first temptation is to turn this stone into a bread. Jesus has the power, but he indicates that he doesn't have the authority because he doesn't have the word from God. And so Jesus refrains, even though he has the power, because he does not have the authority. Later on, we'll see there's a case where there's authority, but there's not power. There's a lack of faith. But I also want to highlight something else you said, that reflection, the idea of this being a reflection, not on them, not personally on the apostles, but rather it indicates where their authority comes from. That's what miracles are all about, is to, when they go and teach the gospel, that they can have evidence, that they can have proof of their authority. Authority means we should listen to this person, right? It means they have a right to tell us something. And so this indicates their authority. Over in John's gospel, when they come back rejoicing after they've been able to cast out demons and do many of these wonders, Jesus says, don't rejoice in the wonders that you've done. Rejoice rather that your names are written in heaven. And so it indicates, not to be puffed up internally, but to rejoice in what those miracles indicate. And they indicate your relationship to God. And so absolutely, that I appreciate you bringing out that particular point of what these miracles would indicate. Well, the next thing that we see is they're given this authority, and then he names them. Matthew names the apostles for us. He says the first is Simon, who's called Peter, Andrew his brother, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the zealot, and Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed him. Now, that is a list of names, and sometimes we read past names and just keep on going. But I think it's appropriate to stop and to think about those names that are listed here, put together in one group as a group collected by Jesus to do a unified work. Michael, what is it that makes this group unlikely to come together to perform a unified work?
There's a couple of things, I think. First, they and we don't get it from that paragraph, but we see in other places that they have different ways that they're making a living. You've got several guys who are fishermen. You've got someone who is a zealot. So he was someone with very strong beliefs toward Israel's trying to get out from under Roman rule, independence. That's what I was looking for. You've got a tax collector who, generally speaking, if he was a typical tax collector, he would not have been beloved by his countrymen. So that's one aspect of it, and we don't know what everyone did, but those are the three that I'm aware of, the three different livelihoods. But then there appears to be some difference in, I would suggest there's probably some difference in ages as well. Jesus begins his ministry when he's 30. That's when a Jewish rabbi was allowed to take disciples. And you would take disciples who were younger than you. And generally speaking, disciples were taken when they were between the ages of 13 and 15. So we know again from another passage that Peter's married, so he's a little bit, he's at least old enough to be married. And he's also, interestingly, he's the only one who has to pay a temple tax with Jesus. If you were younger than 20, you didn't have to pay a temple tax. But when Jesus says, go get the coin out of the fish's mouth and pay a tax for you and me, he doesn't mention the other disciples. And then you throw into that, we know that John lived to be a very old man, dying somewhere around 90 AD. So you put all that together, and it would seem that some of the apostles were less than 20 when Jesus called them. Others may have been in their 20s. So there's a big discrepancy there in age, and as well as what their value system thing. You got simple fishermen, you got people who are fighting for independence, or at least strongly wanting independence, not suggesting that he was a fighter, and then people working for the Romans. It's not what you would expect. If we were going to try and put a group together to go do something, I think we would probably try and find like-minded people. And certainly these people had a spirit that was amenable to the Word of God, and so I guess that's the common thing that Jesus was pulling on.
Right, and I that's really so much of the point I think we need to draw is that there is a like-mindedness, but the like-mindedness is not what we would think of as like-mindedness. We would think these are things to divide, and Jesus sees something that can pull together beyond these things, can become more important than these things. And of course, even with all of that, there's one who ultimately is not overcome by that unity, but rather continues down, I think, a path that he probably is already on, a path of greed, a path of love of money that will be exposed as we go through the gospel. And that, of course, being Judas Iscariot. And Matthew already highlights that for us. He's previewing, what's coming. I would just point out, Matthew is, he doesn't hide the ball concerning himself. He calls himself Matthew, the tax collector. And it's so he almost highlights the difference for us and lets us know, tells us that Simon is the zealot and that he is the tax collector. So I don't think it's doing any harm to make much of those differences. I think those differences are pointed out. That they are. It could have just listed the names, but it listed the names with indicators that we would think would separate these men, and yet it's bundling them together. I appreciate the the points about their age. A lot of times we're thinking of these guys as middle-aged men. Every indication, including the taxes, including the ages of disciples, there's so many indicators that indicate they're much more young than we might generally sort of default to in our minds. Maybe that also helps us understand some of the difficulties Jesus has in explaining things, and that sort of frustration that we experience back and forth. They're young guys learning. At the very early stages of learning, and yet they have the mindset that they're willing to learn and willing to make those changes. All right.
If I might just add in that it helps explain some of the explosions that Peter had.
Yes, and yeah, if he's a little bit older than the other guys, some of the explosions towards him, but as a younger man, just not having learned to control that temper as yet. And I think the passion will serve him well, especially when it gets met with some seasoned maturity. So at any rate. Well, continuing on in verse 5 then, it says these 12 Jesus sent out after instructing them, and then he gives some limitations, and so those limitations calls this commission to be referred to as the limited commission. What limits does he place on them, Johnny, and why do you think those limits might be there?
Well, I think this obviously is in contrast to what we would call the Great Commission. Yeah. In Mark 6:15, it says Jesus said, "Go out into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation." Well, here it's they were commanded not to go out to the Samaritans and to the Gentiles, but rather to the lost sheep of Israel. So the gospel would be presented first to the Jews and then later to the rest of the world. And obviously, I think there were many Jews that would be receptive to the gospel, because in Luke 10 and verse 2, it says, "The harvest truly is great, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest."
Yeah, and so there's the opportunity, the fulfillment of prophecy that we're going to the Jew first, and then also to the Greek. It began, the gospel starts in Judah, or starts in Israel, and then works its way out. All of those things are true. It's interesting that this is already contrasting with, I think, one of the themes that Matthew has been highlighting. We've seen the outsiders being approached, or rather approaching Jesus. So here's the centurion. Here is the tax collector. Here are in so many ways the lepers, these outcasts of society. And now Jesus is pointing towards Israel. I might just add to that in the genealogies. Here are these Gentiles, these faithful Gentiles being highlighted in the genealogy. And so now we come to chapter 10, and Jesus is limiting and say, go to Israel first. I think two things. I think, first of all, there is a genuine desire to open that door for Israel first. They have had this truth for so long, and God is... there is some privilege there that God is saying, You get the first crack. You get to see it before anyone else. I also think this goes into the judgment of Israel. And especially we see this in the book of Romans. As we go through the book of Romans, the case is being made that Israel, that God is just in his treatment of Israel. They are rightly condemned, chapter 2. All have sinned, chapter 3. But as we get into chapter 9, he particularly points out, you've acted just like the other nations. God's been very merciful to you. Don't get upset now that God is pulling the rug away, because you deserve this far sooner than now. Then chapter 10, he says, look at all the preaching that's been done. Don't you dare say, how could we know? I can go all the way back to Moses and through Isaiah and show you've been being preached to for a long time. And then we get into chapter 11, and of course it shows here's the path, here's the way that you can be saved if you would. But all that to say that coming into chapter 10, Jesus is not only offering them, I think, a great kindness, but he's also setting up the argument that Israel will have no ground to say they weren't given a chance. They absolutely have been given every chance, and an even greater chance than Gentiles. And just as he points out in Romans chapter 10, as Paul points out in Romans chapter 10, the Gentiles are the ones who are believing. And so I think this limited commission highlights, it doesn't go against the theme of faithful Gentiles, faithful outsiders that Matthew's been holding up, but rather it highlights that theme. It brings it into greater contrast as Jesus says, go to Israel first. Now there will be some who are faithful. There will be a faithful remnant. And we'll see that illustrated as we go throughout the gospel, as we go over into Acts. But by and large, Israel is going to reject their Messiah. Well, coming down through, as they go out, and it says, do not go in the way of the Gentiles, do not enter into any of the city of the Samaritans, but rather go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And as you go, preach, saying the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Verse 8, heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. Freely you received, freely give. Do not acquire gold or silver or copper for your money belts, or a bag for your journey, or even 2 coats or sandals or staff, for the worker is worthy of his support. Luke, in all of that, in that instruction that he's giving them, to do this teaching, to perform these miracles, what role do the miracles play in all of that? And this kind of goes back to the first question that we asked in verse 1.
And it absolutely does go back to that first question about the authority from Christ, from the Messiah, to do these things. So he's here in verses 7 and 8, he's still telling them what they're going to do. And in verse 8, he talks about the healings and the power that they're going to have in these miracles. But it's connected with the message that they're preaching in verse 7, that they were to, as you already read, preach the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And so one thing I think is important to remember about every miracle is that every time you see a miracle from God, a true miracle, it's always connected with his message. Now there are other times where you only see the message without the miracle, but every time you see a miracle, it's always connected with the message. And here that message is the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And so again, going kind of overlapping with what I was talking about a few minutes ago in that first question, they were to prove their message was sent by the Messiah, by healing the sick in these miracles. And these, especially in these healings, these miracles that they were going to perform, ultimately it's all healing, because he's healing this. They're going to be healing sick and clean people of their diseases. But even in taking out these unclean spirits and casting out demons, that's ultimately a form of healing, bringing them, curing them of that terrible ailment. And so the effects of healing in these miracles reflect so much the message being preached, because what are we but sick with sin? And from in this time where Jesus is telling them to go out and preach, and even today, that message essentially the same, that we need to be cleansed of sickness. Now, today you don't see those miracles, but the message is still there. But we the miracles in this day to kind of the authority and power by which that message is to be given. But also, just as they had received, it says they were to give in the same manner, and that is freely. They freely received there to freely. These men, as again, as we kind of alluded to earlier, they weren't necessarily special. I mean, they didn't deserve, as none of us deserve, to be able to walk with Christ in his journey. But Jesus had done so much for them, so they were to give to others in the same way. And I think that there's definitely application for us today. We don't deserve what Christ offers us and wants to give to us, but he gives it to us should we accept it. And so in the same way, we need to have that same spirit to freely give and to try and preach that message to others.
I think there's just an all-out approach, and I want to say this. This is not to separate. I don't highlight the connection between miracles and teaching in order to separate it from compassion, as if Jesus and his disciples went around robotically, just meticulously doing things in a dispassionate fashion, and just well, I'm going to do this because it will prove this. They actually had compassion on these people. Jesus is said to have that compassion over and over again, and so that is an aspect of it. But it is not simply a means of I want to take away diseases. If Jesus' only goal was to take away diseases, then number one, he failed, because he took them away in such small numbers ultimately. He did do a great many miracles, but not near as many as he could have. And he didn't go near as far as he could have. And so that would be a failure. Not only that, but the failure would be in not fully taking away the consequences. So for instance, in the raising of Lazarus over in John's gospel, Lazarus would die again. And so Jesus doesn't fully take away that. What he fully takes away is those spiritual consequences, just as Luke was alluding to. And so these miracles, while they are tied to compassion, and while they are giving an immediate sense of relief, they are meant to highlight a greater and more important relief that Jesus is ultimately offering in his work and his ministry here on this earth. And so we want to recognize both of those things. We want to be a reflection of the same, that we want to be a relief and comfort and help to all those people around us. But ultimately, we want that to be a pointer to a far greater comfort than we ourselves could ever give. And so don't lose that connection in our own efforts. Well, he gives some interesting instructions, and it's instructions that are different than he will give later towards the end of his life. He tells them to go out and almost as if he's saying, he essentially is saying, don't worry. To what extent? Michael, how were they supposed to take care of themselves during this time that they were going out on this limited commission?
They were supposed to rely on the hospitality of others. It's interesting. There's kind of two different ends of this stick. And I apologize. There's text coming in on the computer, and I can't mute it right now, I don't think. But there's two different ends. The one end is the disciples, the apostles, going out and doing good for people, but then it's also an opportunity for people to do good to them, and that's who God is looking for. In people who are fit for the kingdom are going to be people who are gracious. Yeah. We see that in multiple places. You think later in when we get over to Acts, in the Philippian jailer, what did he do when he came face to face with the power of God? And in his case, it wasn't even anything miraculous. He understood it. It was salvation. And what did he do? He showed hospitality to the people who had shown him what he needed to do to be saved. And so you imagine that you're sitting in your house there in Israel, and you are diseased, or you have a family member who is unable to get up and care for themselves because they fell off the roof and they were working. And one of these guys comes by, and it's the way that Jesus sends them out with no money bag, no second staff. It would, that in and of itself, the way that they're dressed, the way that they're acting, the things that they're saying, the kingdom of God is coming. That would have been an attention grabber. And then when that person comes in and heals you or heals your loved one, a godly person would fall all over themselves to show gratitude for what that person has done. You think the Philippian jailer is on one end of that, and then the other extreme, I think of Nabal, and David and his men took care of Nabal's men. And Nabal's men went to Abigail and said, they took care of us. We were never missing anything while they were around. And Nabal was completely ungrateful, and he was punished for it. And ultimately, that is what God's looking for. He's looking for people who not only understand and accept the gracious offer he's made, but are very, very thankful. And so Jesus said, you look for people like that, and people like that are going to take care of you.
Yeah. And so there's that indicator. I also, when I compare this to the instruction that Jesus would give them later on, where he tells them to sort of prepare for the long haul as he nears his death, and he's telling them the sorts of things that they need to go and make sure that they have. There's a real difference. Here, it's like, I'm sending you out for a brief mission, and relatively brief, and you're going to come back, and we're going to talk about that. Don't take the time to do all of this. Just go. Here's how you'll provide for yourself. And so I think that points to the urgency and immediacy of the mission versus Jesus is about to be gone, and now you've got to live the rest of your lives preaching for me. That's not an immediate mission. That is, now it's time to go out into the world full-time, long-term, for the rest of your lives. Okay, you're going to need the normal things to get along as you go. And so I think we experience times like that. There's moments where an opportunity comes and we don't think about anything else except going and taking that opportunity, whether it be a sick loved one that we feel like there's not much time. We don't think about what I got to get up and go to work tomorrow. No, it's just go. Just get in the car and go. But then there's other ways that we go about the work of the kingdom that's much more methodical and much more daily. This is a unique moment. And so we have those unique moments sometimes, and we will have to react and act like Jesus is talking about here. Live by faith and go and do the right thing in the moment. But then there's the more regular, more prepared. This, in other words, is not just the standard rule of how you live life. Just go on. Don't worry about it. You'll worry about it when you get there. No, that's not what he's counseling here. But there may be moments when that's appropriate. And this was a moment when that was appropriate. And so I think we need that balance. And Jesus himself would give us that balance. Sometimes it's just go. And then other times it's, all right, let's get prepared and then go. Well, coming into the next portion there and really piggybacking on some of what Michael has already indicated there, as far as this being an indication, the idea of reception being an indication. What were the apostles to do when they're received, Johnny? And then what are they to do when they're rejected? You're muted there, Johnny.
Yes, sir.
All right. Yeah.
I think as it says in verse 11, find those who are worthy and stay with them. Greet the household with peace or wish them well. And then text also speaks of those who will not receive them. They will not hear their words, those who reject them. Jesus says, when you leave, shake the dust from your feet. So I think he's saying move along. You've done your best or what is required. But I think there's some other lessons there too. These people don't want to hear the good news of the gospel. So focus your efforts on those who are receptive to the message. These men have a job to do, and it's a very difficult task. So it's the same with them as it is with us today. Surround yourself with good people. Surround yourself with those who will encourage you, and then distance yourself from those who will drag you down, not allow you to do your job.
Yeah, and I think I appreciate the efforts we make to say keep trying. Don't prejudge people, and I think all of that's valuable and true and right. And yet, after we get past the prejudgment stage, sometimes people tell us what they think, and I think we need to listen to what people tell us about what they think. And when people say, "I don't want any part of what you're teaching," we need to be respectful of that. And I think that Jesus is saying just that. Listen to them. If they say we don't want this, go on. Find somebody who does want what you have to offer. That idea is really preached more in the scriptures than maybe we give attention to it. The idea of when people don't want any part of God, that we don't continue to try to force our way in where they will not have us. We saw that back in Matthew chapter 7. In verse 6, don't throw your pearls before swine. Do not give what is holy to the dogs. And so the idea of I'm gonna keep making myself a nuisance to people who don't want any part of me. Jesus himself does not do that. He does not counsel his disciples to do that. Paul indicates in his ministry that he makes his efforts, and when there is rejection, he moves on. I have on occasion tried to remember that. And I've written letters to people who I've made efforts with and just said, listen, if you would like me to stop trying, all you need to do is say so. And I will leave you alone. Now, very rarely do I have people take me up on that and say, yes, stop bothering me, stop. But when they have, I'm done. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not sadness and sorrow on my part. But I'm trying to follow a pattern here. And I think Jesus is not just, he doesn't just say that as a sidebar. It's repetitive. Leave them alone. Go on and spend your time in ways that can be more productive, more valuable. We're limited in our time. And I think that's another element here. There's limited time in this particular endeavor. Don't waste your time. Make sure that it's pointed. Now, I'll say this. You don't have any prospects. You're not getting any doors open. I understand why you're still knocking on the same doors. But when there are multiple prospects, we look for the ones who actually want what we have to offer. And I think Jesus indicates that. Well, he really gets into some instruction as we move on. First of all, let me kind of finish up here this section of the house being worthy. Give it your blessing of peace. If it is not worthy, take back your blessing of peace. Whoever does not receive you nor heed your words as you go out of that city or out of that house or that city, shake the dust off your feet. Truly I say to you, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city. This is another occasion, and Jesus would regularly use this language, pointing to Gentile cities, and now the most infamous cities for depravity and God's judgment. God points to them, Jesus points to them and says, you're worse than they are. Can you imagine being a Jew and hearing that kind of invocation? Well, verse 16 then, he sort of begins to spell out what the road's actually going to look like. Here's the difficulties you're going to encounter. He says, I'm going to send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be as shrewd as serpent and innocent as doves. I want to read a little bit more, and then we're going to come back to that phrase there. It says, but beware of men, for they will hand you over to the courts and scourge you in their synagogues. You will even be brought before governors and kings for my sake as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles. But when they hand you over, do Do not worry about how or what you are to say, for it will be given to you in that hour what you are to speak. For it is not you who speak, but it is the Spirit of your Father who speaks in you. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his children, and children will rise up against his parents and cause them to be put to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, but it is the one who is endured to the end who will be saved. Luke, how do we go into that kind of situation? So much pressure, so much animosity, and live out this notion of being shrewd and innocent at the same time.
Well, not to say that it's going to be easy, but that this verse has always kind of struck me a little bit, to be shrewd as serpents, but as doves, and innocent as doves. Jesus has actually already somewhat used language like this before, talking about in the midst of wolves. I think it was in Matthew 7. It says it talks about wolves in sheep's clothing, and assuredly we still have some of those people today, and especially with the description that he gives in verse 16 of all the things that they're going to go through. Okay, sorry, it said my internet connection was going off. So all right, so it says that they are shrewd as serpents, but innocent as doves. So to be shrewd, I think what he means by this is show sharp powers of judgment. You don't, you have to be actively searching out the most volatile of situations or the volatile of people. But when you take these two traits together, you want to put yourself in a position. We've actually talked about this before in a sermon, but we don't want to be necessarily defensive about everything. We want to be able to be vulnerable. We want to be able to be hurt, be willing to be hurt by people that we want to have studies with. And when we're going out and trying to evangelize, we want to put ourselves out there and maybe be willing to have our heart broken by that person. Now, that doesn't mean, again, that we actively search out the most debatable people and people that want to do us harm, but that also doesn't necessarily that we're just going to not speak just because it doesn't want to hear those things, because the truth, by definition, is going to hurt many people. But again, we want to be willing to be hurt, to be vulnerable with other people as we're trying to evangelize. But we also want to have that shrewdness, the proper discernment to be able to read the situation and maybe sidestep certain dangers, not actively searching them out.
Yeah, I think that's the idea, is that we leave ourselves open. We're willing to go forth. We're not so shrewd in avoiding dangers that we avoid our responsibilities. And yet at the same time, we're not fools. We're not ignorant and naive, that we understand the dangers, and do sidestep when it's possible while still fulfilling our responsibilities. And so that idea, I think sometimes Christians can fall into either of these two extremes, where our shrewdness keeps us from being as open, as hospitable, as we were talking about earlier. Just we're not as willing to leave ourselves open and so forth. And yet, on the other side, I do think Christians can play the fool and leave themselves open to abuses in a way that is not healthy, especially if that leaving ourselves open to abuse causes us to then sort of pendulum swing from one end to the other. And I think that happens a lot, where somebody is that naivete is there, that innocence is there, then they're hurt and they will never be hurt again. And so then it just kind of swings back and forth. But we need to have that balance. That idea of we're thinking people, we understand. When Paul is headed towards Jerusalem and they're saying, don't you know what's going to happen? Paul says, I do know. I do. I'm not a fool. I know what's going to happen when I get to Jerusalem. God has told me what's going to happen when I get to Jerusalem. But he goes, not foolish innocence, but the innocence of trust in God, while he still has the shrewdness. And he exercises that shrewdness. He indicates his Roman citizenship. He maneuvers the Pharisees against the Sadducees, and he's a smart guy, and he knows how to maneuver through all of those difficult situations. All the while, he's just pressing forward, innocently following the Lord and his guidance. And so I think we see a real balance in him as well along those lines. He tells them how far the betrayal will go. It will be among family members. When they persecute you, he says, in one city, you flee to the next. For truly I say to you, will not finish going through the cities of Israel until the Son of Man comes. And he says, the disciple's not above his master. He goes on and says, don't fear those who can destroy the body. Fear those who can destroy both. Fear the one who can destroy both the body and the soul in hell. In verse 28, and he tells them God cares about them. And then he goes on to again talk about the family dynamic, and that it may completely tear your family apart, and you still follow me. You still take up your cross, and you still go wherever I tell you to go. Now, that is not a real good sales pitch, frankly. Here, I'd like you to do something for me. Here's how miserable it's going to be. Why on earth would they still go through this, Michael?
Well, the short answer is the reward. The whole point of his commission here is the kingdom of heaven is at hand. But there are some more immediate comforts that he offers to them. He points out that when they are before when they're on trial, that God is going to give them the words to speak. And this brings to mind again the contrast with what God is asking these people to do and the people he's chosen to do that. What do we know that the people think of them from over in Acts chapter 2? Well, these are unlearned men. And so when I put myself in that situation, if I think, okay, I'm going to be on trial for my life, and I'm going to be up against professional litigators who are going to be arguing persuasively for my death. And what do I have to bring to that argument? And the answer is nothing, because I'm not trained for that. That's a terrifying thought. But Jesus says the Spirit of God is going to be in you, giving you the words to say at that time. And being Jewish men, that would carry some weight, because what is the power? What is the Word of God capable of? Well, the Word of God was capable of building the earth and the universe and all things in 6 days. So that's a level of comfort there that would certainly make me feel better if I were in that case. He gives them, and the Lord does this in different ways, different places. It reminds me how he talked to Jeremiah at times. He also says, it's better for you to be killed by those who can only destroy the body rather than the one who can destroy both body and soul. So, there's a little bit of carrot and the stick. But then he comes back to something that is just, it's astonishing what Jesus says that God knows. He says that he knows even the birds that are alive on the earth. And there's no telling how many birds there are on the earth. But Jesus said God knows every one of them. And then more than that, he says God knows things about you that you don't know yourself, that are not knowable. How many hairs you have on your head. The Lord is aware of that. And so if the Lord is aware of how many birds are alive on his earth, if he is aware of me, or I should say of the disciples, to the extent that he knows how many hairs they have on their head, then you can count on him to know when you're in trouble and to know when you have need of his spirit to speak, to give you those words to speak. You don't have to be concerned because God is not going to forget about you.
Absolutely. And so, and just, I mean, what powerful words, what confidence he gives them, such that young men are willing to go out and face these things. It's invigorating. And it would have been, and it would have been emboldening, and it would have given them courage. I would say encourage, but we use that word lightly. I mean, infuse them with courage that they go out. I would just add one more. There is, you're not suffering anything that I'm not suffering. You want to be my disciple. This is it. This is my life. You want to emulate my life, this is what it looks like. And we would see that continue to be a comfort. For instance, in Acts chapter 5, when they rejoice that they're counted worthy to suffer with Christ. And so there's a joy there that when you truly decide to be somebody's disciple, say, that's the guy I want to be like. And he says, all right, you want to be like me? This is what that looks like. Okay, I do. I really do want to be like you. And so that's part of the comfort as well. So a lot that he gives them there, to give them that boldness. Well, we come back around to the reception of these disciples as we close out this chapter. He who receives you receives me, Jesus says. And then he says, the one who receives a prophet in the name of a prophet shall receive a prophet's reward. He who receives a righteous man in the name of a righteous man will receive a righteous man's reward. And whoever in the name of a disciple gives one of these little ones even a cup of cold water to drink, truly I say to you, he shall not lose his reward. What does that mean, that idea of receiving a righteous man in the name of a righteous man, or a prophet in the name of a prophet? What do you make of all that, Johnny?
Well, I think about the text here, and I really can't imagine all the things that were going through the minds of these men. As Jesus speaks to them here, he's telling them of the persecution that they will face. And they have to be extremely nervous and concerned as Jesus explains all this. And I think Jesus is offering some additional comfort and some encouragement here too. There would be those who would accept the gospel and would receive them kindly into their houses. I think it's important to note that for these people, in addition to offering these apostles their resources, they were also taking a chance for their own lives. Jesus said in verse 40, he who receives you receives me, and he receives him who sent me. Righteous men will receive righteous men, and they will receive their reward. Those who are receiving in the name of a righteous man are those who are of the same mindset as they are. They are those who believe and who are out to do good rather than do evil. And I think it's an important lesson from this is that we all convey a message and a personality or a person, and what we say and how we act represents that person and that message.
Yeah. And I think, to the point that you made, especially of here, these people are taking part in the risk. They're taking part in the work that these men are doing. And maybe here at the end, it is that one extra nudge of encouragement that when you see that, it's easy for us to think sometimes when maybe we're doing good work and we look at the good work somebody else is doing in involvement, maybe we don't think as much of that part. I mean, okay, great. They gave me a place to sleep. And he says, hey, they're jumping in with you. Be encouraged by that and understand they're taking part. You're going and you're being the prophet, but they're taking part in the work of the prophet. I think we can take encouragement from that sometimes there are men doing work that we're not sure how to do, there are other ways we can participate and support and make sure that we are risking as well. Not just, I'll write you a check, though that is needed. But in addition to that, what other ways can we put ourselves on the line with those who are maybe more visible in the work of the kingdom? Here are some ways that other disciples, that others who would come towards Jesus could participate. And he says, don't think lightly of the work that they're doing. And so maybe that's on us to not think lightly of the work somebody else is doing. Maybe it's for us not to think lightly of the work that we may be doing in supporting the work of the kingdom. But at any rate, that closes us out as he's sending his disciples out. As we return in our next study, we're going to be looking at some questions from John the Baptist. We briefly looked at his work in chapter 3. We're going to come back and focus on him with some intensity here in the first part of chapter 11, and I hope that you'll join us for that study. I know that we're not digging into all the elements here. I tried to focus on some of the parts of this chapter we don't focus on as much. We focus a lot on the persecution and the family division. We don't really address maybe some of the things that he says right here at the beginning of the text, and so we gave that a little bit more time. But if you have other questions, some things that we didn't address, then we're more than happy to talk to you about those things. We'd invite your comments on this YouTube video, or you can contact us through our website. But we appreciate you continuing to study with us, continue to join us through these classes, and we hope that that they're helpful to you and that you're able to draw nearer to Jesus, to God, to know more about him. That's our goal each and every day. We appreciate your time, and we hope that you have a continued good week and blessings as you continue to draw near to God, and hope that you'll join us again next time.